Good evening. Welcome to Saving the Planet Cost Effectively, a webinar by Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar to the University of Missouri, Joseph Aldy. I'm Zach Miller, a professor of economics and former president of the Alpha chapter of Missouri, of Phi Beta Kappa here at Mizzou. Professor Aldy's virtual visit to Mizzou is sponsored by the Alpha chapter, Department of Economics, Department of Political Science, Harry S. Truman School of Public Affairs, all at Mizzou. Before I introduce Professor Aldy, I'd like to introduce Professor Alex Barker, Director of the Museum of Art and Archaeology and current president of the Alpha chapter, to say a few words about Phi Beta Kappa. Alex.
Good evening, everybody. As most of you know, Phi Beta Kappa is the nation's most prestigious academic honor society. It advocates specifically for the value of education and achievement in the liberal arts and sciences. 17 presidents, 41 Supreme Court justices, and more than 140 Nobel laureates have been inducted as members. It's championed those benefits of higher education and the importance of scholarly inquiry since before the founding of the Republic. And this year, our induction speaker will be one of our most recent Nobel laureates, the Missouri's own George Smith. The Phi Beta Kappa Alpha chapter of Missouri was founded at the university in 1901, and our first speaker was Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. In addition to the induction of seniors meeting the highest standards, we also award scholarships to a select number of juniors, recognizing exceptional merit, service, and promise. We also organize special presentations like the one this evening, and we're very excited about tonight's program. On behalf of the chapter officers and members, welcome. Back to you, Zach.
Thank you, Alex. Well said. Joseph E. Aldy is professor of the practice of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, a university fellow at Resources for the Future, a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Professor Aldy's research focuses on climate change policy, energy policy, and regulatory policy. He also serves as a faculty chair of the Mosavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government Regulatory Policy Program. In 2009-10, he served as the special assistant to the president for energy and the environment at the White House. Professor Aldy previously served as a fellow at Resources for the Future, co-director of the Harvard Project on International Climate Agreements, co-director of the International Energy Workshop, and worked on the staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. The Department of Econ here at Mizzou is proud to have two of our own faculty members who have served on the latter. Professor Aldy earned his doctorate in economics from Harvard University and MEM and bachelor's degrees from Duke University. Before we begin, anyone may submit questions to Professor Aldy at any time through the chat function. However, we will defer answers until the very end. So having said that, Professor Aldy, we're excited to have you here. Welcome to Mizzou.
Great, thank you, Zach. It's a real pleasure to be here, at least to be here virtually. Wish I could be there with you all in person, but we're going to make the most of the technology that we have available to us. I'm going to share my screen for my presentation. How does that look, Zach? Is that good?
Yeah, it's great. Great.
So I want to spend some time talking about climate change policy. It's an issue I've been working on dating back to the 1990s when I was a young pup on the staff at the Council of Economic Advisors. I was responsible for the economic analysis we were undertaking during the 1997 Kyoto climate negotiations. And there, I think we were seeing sort of a fundamental change in the way we address environmental policy in the United States, but also starting to see the beginning of that for countries around the world, recognizing the power of leveraging the profit motive to using and tailoring markets to our environmental advantage. And whether it was with efforts during those Kyoto negotiations to push for flexible market-based approaches to reducing pollution, building on successful experiences that were emerging at the time in the United States to reduce sulfur pollution from our power plants. And what we're seeing being used around the world now, we recognize there's incredible value in using cost-effective policy to try to address our environmental problems. And when we think about, of course, the most critical, most challenging environmental problem of the 21st century, the task of combating and managing the risk posed by climate change, I think it's all the more critical for us to be thoughtful, creative in the ways in which we use cost-effective instruments to save the planet. Now, before I get into some of the policy design, though, I want to sort of lay the foundation for how we think about the challenge. Sort of share sort of an understanding of sort of where we are in terms of our understanding of global emission trajectories, global efforts to try to address those emissions, and what's happening to the climate now and what may happen in the future. So first, when we sort of think about the challenge is to recognize that despite a number of efforts through multiple UN climate change conferences, we have seen global emissions of carbon dioxide, and for that matter, all greenhouse gases, steadily rise over the past really 100+ years since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. What we've seen, for example, when you look at the red line here, is that for the most part, carbon dioxide emissions move in lockstep with economic growth. It tends to grow a little more slowly than GDP when we think about it summed across the planet. But usually when we've seen our emissions of carbon dioxide decline year on year, it's because we've also experienced a rather sluggish year of economic growth or even a decline globally in economic output. So you can see, for example, in the 1970s, around the times of the two oil shocks, both the increase in energy prices because of the oil shocks and slower economic growth contributed to a decline in emissions. You can see in the early 1990s, a little dip in emissions, and that's really the collapse of the former Soviet bloc, the shutting down a lot of the energy intensive industry in Eastern Europe. You can see, for example, the recession in 2009, a little bit of a dip in emissions. But in general, emissions have continued to go up, even though the world got together in 1992 at the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit to agree on what is now the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the global treaty that governs multilateral efforts to address climate change. The 1997 Kyoto Conference, the first time the developed countries of the world agreed on emission targets. The Copenhagen Conference of 2009, the first time emerging economies of the world joined those developed countries in agreeing to limit their emissions. And then the Paris Conference of 2015, which was truly the first global agreement in which virtually every country in the world has committed to reduce their emissions. And the challenge is, while we expect emissions for the year 2020 to be lower because of the COVID recession, they're likely post-COVID to continue to recover and grow. What does that mean in practice? Well, first, the increase of the flow of emissions in the atmosphere means that the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere have been increasing, and they've been increasing at an increasing rate. And so we're now approaching levels well above 400 parts per million that we've not experienced in millions of years on the planet. And it helps to sort of explain why we continue to see growing temperatures, So we can see here, looking at the recorded measures of temperature for the Northern Hemisphere. This is data provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they sort of estimate, compared to the average over the 20th century, sort of where are July temperatures relative to that average. And what you can see is that for the first part of the 20th century, we're sort of below that average, but there's been this kind of increase, and virtually every year over the last 40 years has been well above that average. And we can see that not only are temperatures increasing, but increasing as well at an accelerating rate. We're now about 1 degree centigrade above our pre-industrial temperatures because of the nature of both the thermal lags in the climate system and because of the nature of the long-lived energy consuming capital we have around the world. We've probably already locked in about 1.5 degrees C, meaning if we use all the existing power plants, all the cars, all the furnaces in our homes, et cetera, that are already in use today, just to the end of their economic lifetime, that will contribute to at least 1.5 degrees C of warming. If you think about new investment we make next month or next year or next decade that continues to use and consume fossil fuels, that's only going to continue to contribute to rising temperatures. And we've heard recently in the past few years from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change how severe climate change risks might be, going from 1.5 degrees C to 2 degrees C, and certainly going beyond 2 degrees C as well. In fact, in the Paris Agreement of 2015, the world community agreed on trying to limit temperatures well below 2 degrees C relative to the pre-industrial level, and to aspire to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. Given how much we've already put into the atmosphere, though, this is truly a daunting task. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their last assessment report, pulled together modeling analyses by research teams all over the world, trying to understand what is necessary in terms of changing the trajectory of our emissions in order to keep warming to 2 degrees C or less relative to pre-industrial levels. Now, there's a lot of uncertainties that characterize the science. There's really no doubt in the scientific community that the combustion of fossil fuels contributes to climate change that will cause us on net harms. There is, though, uncertainties on how quickly this will happen, how bad it will happen, and where across the world at any point in time those damages will occur. So we can look, though, at these so-called integrated assessment models that bring in an understanding of energy systems and emissions, economic activity, and the global climate and temperatures to be able to sort of characterize what do our emissions trajectories need to be globally in order to limit warming to 2 degrees C, and to do so with a 50-50 probability. So we can't even guarantee that we can do actions today to limit warming to 2 degrees C. But we can take some significant actions that would significantly increase the probability of preventing warming beyond 2 degrees C. The blue line here showing our historic carbon dioxide emissions is the same as what you saw a few slides ago when I illustrated the historic international agreements. This kind of red line is showing what these models project, absent any new climate change policies. And what you see is basically a continuation of that growth in emissions, where emissions would probably double over the course of the next 50 years before they start to plateau. If we were to limit warming to 2 degrees C, though, we need to dramatically reduce our emissions. We need to peak them now and cause them to decline quite significantly over the course of the century. And within about 50 years, we need to have global emissions to be on net zero. This is the fundamental challenge, that in order to really stabilize our climates, at some point, we have to stop adding CO2 to the atmosphere on net globally, which, given that about 80% of the world's energy comes from burning fossil fuels, and it has been the foundation of our energy, the foundation of our economies for more than a century, it's really a daunting task to think about how we turn the economy around while still continuing to grow our economies and raise the livelihoods of people around the world. The challenge, though, is if we don't actually make that progress and we continue to put carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we risk suffering really severe climate change impacts. Now, there's been a lot of talk about climate catastrophe, climate emergencies. In fact, Oxford Dictionary identified climate emergency as the word of the year for 2019. And while I don't mean that it's truly an existential threat right now to the entire planet and to the entire species, certainly we're going to suffer, peoples around the world in different communities, in different countries, they will suffer locally catastrophic impacts because of climate change. Whether it's going to be for those who live, if you look in the upper left-hand corner here, on fisheries around coral reef ecosystems or tourism around coral reef ecosystems. And the fact that warmer temperatures are causing the corals to die are going to put those economies and those livelihoods at risk. We can think back whether it was in 2018 or in California or 2020, early 2020 in Australia, or again in the West right now, the forest fires that are being amplified by a warming, drier climate in those regions. If we look in the upper right-hand corner, we can see what is just a normal full moon tide now in South Beach, Miami, where because of rising sea levels, you can have the roads made almost impassable just by a full moon tide. There's serious concern about the prospects that a warmer climate could increase the spread of vector-borne diseases, such as malaria carried by mosquitoes. Certainly, this is something that I think is all the more acute when we think about the COVID experience we're undergoing right now. What are the sort of the strengths and the weaknesses of our public health surveillance system with respect to COVID has implications for how we think about the potential risk for the spread of diseases under a warming climate. If we look in the bottom center, we can recognize that there's going to be threats to the ability to raise food to feed people around the world in a climate that is, again, in many places going to be both warmer and drier. And then we can think about the concerns and the risk associated with more severe storms, whether it's typhoons like this one that hit Japan last year, or we can think about the really increase in the intensity and frequency of storms the Gulf Coast have experienced over the past 5 years. All these, though, are potentially made all the more severe when we think about what might be the impact of climate-induced migration. That as people recognize where they live is a place where they can no longer grow enough food to eat, where it may be too hot to even go outside and work, even if it's not in farming, where they may find that there's not enough water for them to be able to continue in their communities. And what we might see then are truly large-scale migration that puts some of the migration, whether it's from Central America to the United States, whether it's from Syria into Western Europe, that we could be talking about orders of magnitude more people moving. We might be talking about orders of magnitude of people moving within countries as well. And there's a question about how our governments and how our public policies will be able to address and deal with that incredibly large scale increase in the movement, the involuntary movement of people in response to a warming, drying climate. Now, that's just sort of set the stage on climate change. I really don't want to get into a discussion in the Q&A about the science of climate change. I know some people raise questions about it. As an economist, I think about this in the context of decision-making under uncertainty, which is that I can recognize that there are some uncertainties, that you may want to assign some probabilities to any of these impacts. But when I think about not just the probability of an impact, but when I think about the magnitude, it justifies taking what I think is a prudent approach to policy so that we can better manage these risks, even if we can't fully quantify the likelihood of them happening or say with certainty whether something is going to happen or not. Let me turn a little bit now to the policy response. And I want to start with the next two slides to sort of talk about a bit of the tension that characterizes, I think, the policy challenge in addressing climate change. First, it's been recognized by the International Monetary Fund, the International Energy Agency, the OECD, the World Bank, basically every international organization that does analysis on this issue, that energy prices around the world are too low. That basically what we have then is the fact that fossil fuels are being subsidized because they don't pay for all of their cost to society. That the fossil fuel prices may reflect the cost of bringing the fuels to market. It may reflect their opportunity cost of production, but they're not reflecting the opportunity cost they impose on society because of climate change or air pollution. This figure here is showing what the IMF estimates as global energy subsidies, specifically fossil fuel subsidies. And about $500 billion of this is the fact that many countries around the world, especially in developing countries, especially in energy exporting countries, price their fuels below their opportunity cost. But the IMF recognizes that it's a lot more than just the states subsidizing the fuels relative to their opportunity costs. It's also recognizing they're not accounting for the damages they're imposing on society through a warming climate and through local air pollution. And so they're estimating right now, every year, there's about $1 trillion of climate damages associated with the burning of fossil fuels around the world. There's about $2 trillion in air pollution damages. Basically, the fine particulates that are emitted when we burn fossil fuels cause premature mortality, whether among the elderly, the infirm, young children. And so right here, you recognize there's just incredible damages that are not being reflected in the prices of fossil fuels. And so the standard economic policy advice that comes from all these international organizations is to say you should raise the price of energy. The problem, of course, is that the public thinks energy prices are too high. So we can look at times in the past when governments around the world have tried to raise energy prices. In Nigeria, which have been, as a major oil exporter, had been subsidizing their fuels, they decided to significantly raise on January 1 of 2012 their fuels, and you got street protests in response to that increase in fuel prices. In Mexico, they've tried to rationalize in the last half dozen or so years their energy pricing. And again, when they tried to raise their fuel prices, we saw a street protest slow down the economy. In 2000 in the UK, so this isn't just a developing country issue or an energy exporting, necessarily an energy exporting country issue. In the UK in the year 2000, the frustration was really about very high petrol taxes. So they had some of the highest taxes in the world in the UK, and you actually had various lorry drivers around the country basically do a slow down strike where you get two big semis next to each other on a freeway, and then they would just slow down to a very slow speed as a way to sort of protest these high taxes and eventually push the UK government to reduce their taxes. And then, as some of you may be familiar, we had the Yellow Vest protest in 2018 and 2019 in France, which was in response to the French trying to raise their carbon tax that would affect both the fuels used on transportation and the fuels used for heating in some of their homes. So we've seen, whether it's for correcting fossil fuel subsidies, whether it's energy taxes, whether it's a carbon tax, people have been pushing back on raising energy prices. And that is a key challenge here when we recognize what we really need to do to start changing investment and changing behavior. So we can think about this. While drawing these lessons about energy prices, we can think of those sort of three fundamental ways we can try to promote emission mitigation. The first, though, is to raise the price, but not necessarily on energy per se, but on the emissions associated with the energy. And we can do two sort of standard approaches, so-called cap and trade, which is a policy that's going to limit the total quantity of emissions, but think about a market-based approach to implement that quantitative limit, or a carbon tax where we directly price through the tax code the emissions of CO2. And I'll go through an illustration of each of these in a moment. Second, we can think about how we use subsidies. So we can actually say, here is a piece of equipment, a technology, some capital that is very good for the climate. We want to subsidize that. So for example, in the United States since 1992, we've been using tax credits for wind power and solar power and geothermal as a way to help drive out the investment in the power sector, these renewable sources of electricity. We can also use regulations. In this case, for example, we can think about fuel economy standards that try to improve the efficiency with which we burn gasoline and diesel in our cars and light trucks. But here the government is really sort of prescribing what specific firms have to do in order to comply with that policy and regulation. So to sort of illustrate carbon pricing, the largest cap and trade program in the world is the EU emission trading scheme. Now it's quite fascinating the EU supports this. The EU used to be opposed to market-based approaches. In 1997 at the Kyoto climate negotiations, they were adamantly opposed to the US proposal for using a market-based approach to reduce their emissions. But then they soon realized it was probably going to be the most effective way for them to comply with their obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. So they then designed across all their sources of emissions in the power sector, large manufacturing facilities. They've been growing it slowly to other sectors of the economy since then. But really over the past 15 years, it served as the leading effort to try to reduce CO2 emissions in the EU. It starts with setting an aggregate emissions cap. So you can think about this as your emissions goal. It's going to cover all of the firms that are regulated by your program. And you may set that cap to decline over time as you become more and more ambitious in your policy. You take that cap and you divide it into emission allowances, say 1 ton of emissions per allowance. And that gives the holder of that allowance the right to emit 1 ton of CO2. The allowances can then be either auctioned, so you can raise revenues, or they can be given away for free, for example, as a function of historic emissions by the industry. And in order to comply with the policy, the sources of emissions have to hold these allowances to cover their emissions. As a result, though, these sources can buy and sell allowances with each other, and we get a secondary market for allowances. That's where the pricing comes into play. So the government doesn't actually set the price, but by effectively rationing the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that you can emit in this market, then a price emerges as firms buy and sell that scarce right to emit. Now, in contrast, we can think about a carbon tax, a prominent proposal originally from former Secretary Baker, former Secretary Schultz, so-called sort of conservative approach to carbon tax, a tax and dividend proposal that has now elicited support from people across the political spectrum and much of the business community and part of the environmental community, is the proposal for a tax and dividend for the United States. Here, the idea is that you would cover all the fossil fuel emissions in the economy, so it'd be an economy-wide carbon tax that would start at $40 a ton CO2. So to put that in context, that's probably something on the order of about 35 cents a gallon of gasoline. It may be several cents per kilowatt hour of electricity, but that's going to vary a lot depending on how much of the mix of your power comes from coal or natural gas or zero carbon sources like nuclear or renewables. But the idea, though, is that you're starting to put this price on carbon. It's going to have a differential impact on different sources of energy. It's going to cause you to start to shift towards those lower carbon sources of energy. It would be applied to fossil fuels based on their carbon content. This would actually make the monitoring very simple. In fact, in the US tax code right now, we already tax on a per barrel basis all the crude oil in the US that's going into refineries or coming in as refined product into ports. We already tax on a per short ton basis all the coal coming out of coal mines in the United States. The former on oil supports the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. The latter supports the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund for coal. So it'd be very easy to sort of piggyback on this existing system. It's easy to convert a short ton of coal to a ton of CO2. It's easy to convert a barrel of oil to a ton of CO2. So long as you burn these fully, you get, with a high degree of precision, the CO2 emissions. So you're literally would be adding one line to a couple of forms, and you've already covered most of the CO2 emissions in the economy. You need to do a little bit more for natural gas, but administratively, it'd be very simple to do. Now, the tax and dividend approach would likely raise in his first years probably a couple $100 billion. It's a big revenue raiser. But the intent of this plan is to take all those revenues and return them to households on a per capita basis. So every quarter, every person in America who has a social security number would get a check from the federal government that is their dividend from the carbon tax. Over time, this carbon tax would grow, and this proposal would grow 5% per year. And then a little bit later in the presentation, I'll show a few figures to illustrate the economic and environmental impacts, as well as the distributional impacts of this proposal. Now, these two examples aren't alone. We've got carbon pricing policies all over the world. The World Bank does an annual review of trends in carbon pricing. They found that there are, at the national level, nearly 50 either cap and trade programs or carbon tax programs or hybrid programs, and nearly 30 at the subnational level, either for major cities or a few states and provinces. We see this in the US, where we have cap and trade programs for CO2 in both California and in the Northeast states through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. But as you can see from the figure on the right, they're really quite common across the world, through other provinces in Canada, through much of Europe, but even becoming more common in South America and in parts of Asia. Now, when we think about sort of how much of the world's emissions are covered by carbon pricing, we can sort of see the trends over time. That before the EU ETS began, you only had probably a couple percentage points at best of the world's emissions covered by carbon pricing. But now we have about 20% of the world's emissions, about 15% under cap and trade or quantity-based policies, about 5% under carbon tax or price-based policies that are covering the emissions of carbon dioxide around the world. So it's really started growing. And in fact, now we have China, for their power sector, are covering through a quantity-based, a variant of cap and trade, a quantity-based instrument to reduce their emissions. Now, this policy approach has been quite common in the United States. We've seen cap and trade and tradable performance standards that instead of limiting the total quantity of emissions, it often be a rate, such as the emissions per megawatt hour of power you might produce, or making sure that a certain percentage of your power is coming from renewable sources. But again, this is going to be as a function of how much power in general your utility generates. And so these end up being implemented through a kind of tradable credit program that has the same kind of incentives and properties as a cap and trade program. So we have, as I noted, state carbon dioxide cap and trade programs in California and on the East Coast. We have about 30 states around the country have renewable portfolio standards that mandate a share of their power must come from renewable sources, and utilities can buy and sell their compliance obligations, renewable energy credits, as a way of demonstrating their compliance with these state programs. We have to address local air pollution. Power plants around the country have to comply with the EPA cross-state air pollution rule, and they can buy and sell the right to pollute through that. We have across the entire country for transportation fuels a renewable fuel standard that mandates a certain percentage of our fuels come from lower carbon biofuels, and refineries buy and sell the credits for compliance under this program. Likewise, refineries buy and sell credits to reduce benzene, a carcinogen that occurs from the combustion of gasoline. We're reducing benzene levels in gasoline, but refineries can buy and sell that across them as well. And for that matter, refineries buy and sell sulfur credits as a part of their obligations to reduce sulfur pollution. And so basically anywhere in America, if you consume energy, which is all of us, you are actually consuming energy that is subject to a kind of market-based approach to reducing pollution, whether it's for CO2 or a local air pollutant. Now, I think the other, and I should also note, California has a low carbon fuel standard, the LCFS as well, that is also a tradable credit program. Now, the thing is that it's not just governments saying, here's going to be these prices. It starts to feed into the decision-making in businesses around the country. So a lot of companies have started using so-called internal carbon pricing. They're trying to think through what might be the price of carbon in the future under, say, future government regulations or public policies or a tax, how that should inform both their near-term investment decisions and their longer-term strategy development. Now, the Carbon Disclosure Project is actually a group of major investors who have tens of trillions of dollars of assets under management who've been pushing for companies to become more transparent in both how they evaluate their climate change risk, but also how they think about carbon risk, if you will. How do you think about what their potential obligations might be if they are regulated to address climate change, or if they may be producing a good or a service that is going to be affected by a carbon tax? And so companies have now, for the last half dozen or so years, been disclosing through the Carbon Disclosure Project if they've been using a carbon price in their internal corporate planning. Now, this is showing across a number of industries, whether it's auto manufacturing with GM, or in the power sector with Exxon, IT with Google, the energy sector with Devon and ExxonMobil, manufacturing with Owens Corning, or even the financial sector in BNY. You see a lot of variation in what these companies are doing. Now, it's interesting in the case of ExxonMobil, they had some of their internal documents become public as a part of legal proceedings with the state of New York. And from that, we actually got a sense of like how they think about carbon price planning. And this figure here, which comes from some of those documents, illustrates how they were looking at different carbon pricing policies around the world, thinking about sort of what the prices are now and what they will likely be going forward into the future, trying to sort of project what they think those policies will be. And given that they're an oil company, so when they're developing an oil field or they're building a refinery, we're talking about investments that they plan to utilize for decades. They're really thinking about sort of the long-lived nature of those investments, and their planning really focuses on 2030 and beyond, which is part of what motivates their decision to use a high carbon price that's really used as a kind of robustness check on investments. It's not clear how many of their investments have changed as a result of using that carbon price. I have spoken with people in other companies in the oil and gas industry where their use of an internal carbon price has changed some of their investment decisions. And we see some companies like, say, Microsoft, it's literally used as an internal carbon tax in the company. So every ton of CO2 in Microsoft that is attributed to the company is subject to now a $15 a ton carbon tax that is then being used to finance a lot of their investment in new low and zero carbon technologies. Now, the question, of course, is why do we do and why are we pushing for sort of carbon pricing when we might say, look, we've used regulations in the past. We think about the improvement in air quality in the United States under the Clean Air Act. Most of that was done through conventional regulations. We think about what we've been able to do to push out renewables in the United States. A lot of that's been done through subsidies. So the question is, why don't we continue to use those as our instruments to try to address climate change? And I think the challenge is that in practice, we're going to start realizing what I think are diminishing returns to regulatory approaches and to subsidy approaches. For subsidies, the challenge is that they just are becoming more and more expensive as clean energy deployment increases. Subsidizing a wind farm, about 2.5 cents every kilowatt hour generated, doesn't cost the federal treasury that much when wind farms are a small fraction of the power sector. But now that they're on the order of, in conjunction with solar, almost 10% of power generation, it's getting more and more expensive. And that's more and more taxes you have to raise somewhere else in the economy. The burden that you're placing on the rest of the economy when you raise those taxes in order to finance this, that you can't imagine, I think, using subsidies to build out to 100% renewable, as some advocates have called for. When we think about regulation, I think there's serious concern among those who are focused on environmental regulation, environmental law, when they think about the potential for changes in the administrative state. The evolution of the courts in recent years suggests that there may be limits to how ambitious you can be and how creative and discretionary you can be in using existing statutory authorities to develop new regulations to address climate change. I also think that the kind of industry-specific, technology-specific approaches that we've seen for addressing pollution or clean energy through subsidies and regulations just aren't well suited for the emerging energy economy. Now, think about electric vehicles and how they're starting to change transportation. It's not clear what it means to mandate that some of our fuels have to have ethanol in them, or even low carbon ethanol, if they're going to all be electrified. It's not clear what it means to have an efficiency standard through fuel economy standards if we're going to be, which is measured in miles per gallon of gasoline in a world in which we're electrifying vehicles. There's also concerns, I think, when we start to see industry walls coming down, where electricity is competing in transportation, electricity is competing with heating fuels in buildings, that technology-specific approaches and industry-specific approaches don't really account for the changes in technology that we see playing out in the energy economy now. So I think that's all the more reason why there's value in having something that is a common incentive across the economy that all cares not about your input, like which technology are you using, but cares about the outcome. Are you reducing CO2 emissions? And that kind of technology neutral approach can induce even more innovation and do so across every potential use of technology in the economy by being technology neutral. Let me talk a little bit now about sort of carbon pricing impacts before we wrap up and take some questions. So the first and foremost is, what kind of environmental bang for the buck are we getting if we decide to price carbon? And when we think about the tax and dividend approach that I described earlier, there's been some analysis to show how much it could drive down our emissions of CO2. So this is based on some analysis that some of my colleagues at Resources for the Future did with their model, showing that a carbon tax at $40 a ton, very quickly, it pushes out a lot of coal. Coal takes a hit very soon. So you see, even though coal combustion has come down a lot in the US power sector, it comes down another 80% over about the next half dozen years if we start with a carbon tax at about $40 a ton. So that causes a big immediate drop in emissions, but you see continued decline so that emissions are about half their 2005 level by the year 2035. So that's a big change in the environment. You can see here what President Obama in 2015 had pledged the United States to do as a part of the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions as much as 28% by the year 2025. So it would go beyond what the last president had proposed doing to address climate change. Now, of course, the concern that many have are that imposing a carbon tax is going to impose then economic cost. And the sense is, though, is that the aggregate economic costs are going to be kind of hard to actually pick up in our national income and product accounts. So this figure here, again, from my colleagues at Resources for the Future, is showing sort of what we project GDP to be, and in the sort of gray line on top with no new climate policy. And the black line below that is suggesting what GDP is going to grow under a tax that begins at $40 a ton and increases 5% a year. So the two things I would take away from this are the economy continues to grow. It grows at basically almost the same rate, modestly lower levels by the year 2035. But importantly, these costs are much smaller than the costs associated with climate change. Now, of course, the question is not just sort of what's the aggregate economic cost, but what are the distributional impacts and who really is bearing these costs across the economy. And I think one thing that's important, there's been a lot of concerns among environmentalists, among progressives, that a carbon tax raises energy prices. Low-income households consume more of their budget in energy consumption than higher-income households, and so it's going to be really bad for low-income households. It'd be regressive for them. But the appeal of a dividend approach is that actually the gain in disposable income is positive for about the first 7 deciles of the income distribution. So if you're in a household whose income is at the 70th percentile or lower in the income distribution, because of that dividend check that comes in every quarter under this proposal, you actually have more income, even though you're paying a little bit more for your gasoline and your electricity and for the energy being used embedded in the goods you consume. It's only for the very highest income brackets, because they consume a lot more energy, do we actually see a loss in income relative to that per capita dividend check. So across the distribution of incomes, it's actually quite progressive. Now, I will acknowledge that there are going to be some parts of the country that may be more reliant on coal. So we think about sort of Appalachian coal country. They may be harder hit. And there are ideas out there and proposals out there for how you try to facilitate a transition and create new job opportunities in those communities that would be hardest hit from this sort of energy transformation under a carbon tax. But again, the carbon tax generates a lot of revenues that would allow you to carve out a little bit to help and target some of these hardest hit communities and still allow you to give back the vast majority of the resources to help households in the lower part of the income distribution. Now, I think it's also important when we think about the potential that such a policy could play in terms of US leadership on climate. Really, under this administration, the United States has abdicated leadership on global climate change policy. It's been quite an isolationist approach. The world came together in 2015 to agree on the Paris Agreement, and the United States is now the only country to say they're going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. Now, reestablishing leadership requires more than just saying, I'm going to rejoin Paris. Vice President Biden has said he would do that. It requires more than just giving good speeches. You need to demonstrate your seriousness with your domestic efforts. And I think a good example of this was in 2014, the United States and China had a bilateral agreement that really galvanized the international community and got us going towards the successful outcome of the 2015 climate negotiations in Paris. But their bilateral agreement really focused on their domestic actions. What the US would do in terms of its domestic policy, ramping up fuel economy standards. At the time, President Obama had just finished promulgating the regulation to limit emissions in the power sector. through the Clean Power Plan. China had their own policies to reduce through cap and trade their CO2 emissions. And that really established a much more credible claim that they're leaders on climate change and that they can get the rest of the world to come in behind them. So I think an aggressive policy to price carbon would be one in which to demonstrate to the rest of the world that the United States is back in the game and willing to, given its historic contribution to climate change, given its resources, willing to play a key role leading the world in tackling this problem. Now, the political economy, though, I will acknowledge is challenging. There's sort of a theory of the case of this kind of great swap that would have to occur. You know, when we hear the advocates in the business community for it, they're willing to do a pretty high tax on carbon. ExxonMobil and BP both support a $40 a ton carbon tax that's on their primary good that they produce of oil and gas. Now, they don't even want some of the revenues from that tax coming back to them. They're happy to go into households. Now, their ask, though, is to reduce regulatory burdens. They don't want to be under Clean Air Act regulation and other kinds of regulations. And the question is whether or not the environmental community would engage in that kind of trade. So there's a question here when we think about the political economy, of course, it's important to think about the winners and the losers and the use of the revenues. Too often, the reason why we've maintained, I think, the status quo is that the losers are concentrated and they see how bad they will lose under climate policy and they push hard and they lobby hard to keep that from happening. The winners tend to be much more dispersed. It's really the global community over generations to come if we're tackling climate change effectively. The dividend approach, so the use of the revenues, actually makes it that much more salient for the American public that they can enjoy some of the benefits immediately. That may help counter, I think, some of the lobbying by the losers, especially, say, I think in the coal industry, if we were to tax carbon along these lines. Now, of course, we had a recent debate emerge over the past 2 years about a Green New Deal, and to be honest, there are some, I would say, moderate Democrats would like a carbon tax to be a pillar of a kind of bipartisan Green New Deal, but there are progressives who think of a carbon tax as a poison pill. They don't trust markets. They don't want to see a market-based approach. They don't want to give up some of the regulatory authorities in order to get a carbon tax through. And so there's a question about whether or not, you know, there can be a return to some degree of bipartisanship where a Green New Deal might include a carbon tax, but might include as well aggressive investment in infrastructure. It may be that you could use some of the carbon tax revenues to finance some of the infrastructure that Green New Deal advocates call for. I think there's also value, though, in identifying a cost-effective approach by making sure we're getting the biggest bang for our buck and the resources we're using may make it easier for us to set and actually achieve our more ambitious environmental and climate change goals. So let me close. I know you should have time to ask questions of me, but I want to close with a couple of questions for you and then talk a little bit more broadly about climate policy strategy in order to save the planet cost effectively. I think there's a key question about whether or not a democracy can actually price carbon high enough to decarbonize the economy. And I don't just mean can we set a high enough carbon tax, I also am not sure we can do aggressive enough regulations, aggressive enough subsidies to decarbonize the economy, but that's what's called for when we think about climate science. I think there's a question about whether or not the United States can use carbon pricing policy to enable it to reestablish global leadership. And it's going to be important not just to be a leader on climate, but how to reestablish our relationship and our leadership on an array of issues by demonstrating to the world we recognize this is a first-tier issue for many other countries in the world and that we're now taking it seriously again. I think there's a question about how a national carbon pricing is going to fit with state climate change programs. We've got a lot more that's happening now than we did, say, a decade ago. And there's a question about how they all fit together and whether or not they can fit together in a way that's highly complementary. There's a question about whether or not you could work a carbon pricing policy in a Green New Deal or in a post-COVID economic recovery and infrastructure program. And finally, I think there's a key question, which is whether or not carbon pricing or any suite of mitigation policies are actually enough to save the planet. And so the concern I have is that when I look at the damages that we're realizing today, whether it's the forest fires out west or the storms in the Gulf, when I think about the kind of flooding not too long ago that came through St. Louis and the surrounding region there in your part of the country, that I don't think mitigation is going to be sufficient. It's been our sort of primary approach to tackling climate change, but we're going to need to broaden our approach to climate policy. And I've been working recently with a colleague on this, Richard Zeckhauser, where we sort of think about a broader policy portfolio that continues to push hard on emission mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and perhaps even develop the technologies to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere so that we might even realize negative net emissions around the planet. But given that climate damages are already occurring and are going to continue to occur, we need to be able to pursue adaptation, to invest in making our infrastructure more resilient, to invest more in our public health infrastructure, to help people, the vulnerable people, become less exposed to climate change, which means we're going to need to reduce damages for any given level of climate change. But we're going to also need to think about amelioration, about how we're going to be able to sort of reduce climate change for any given level of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. And this is where we get into some of the more provocative consideration about so-called solar geoengineering efforts. So the idea there is to try to mimic some of what we've seen historically from volcanic eruptions that have put fine particles into the upper atmosphere, that deflected some of the incoming sunlight, reduced the Earth's energy balance for a short period of time, and actually cooled the planet. So in 1991, Mount Pinatubo did that, had a cooling effect for about 18 months. Here, the idea is we might build a fleet of high altitude airplanes that every day would go into the upper atmosphere and deposit sulfur particles into the upper atmosphere to deflect some of the incoming sunlight to offset some of the warming associated with what we've already pumped into the atmosphere. It would buy us time until we could really drive down our emissions and perhaps even commercialize carbon dioxide removal technology to bring CO2 out of the atmosphere. But I think given how dire the climate change risk can be for many peoples around the world, we're going to need to take and use every potential policy tool at our disposal. And a cost-effective approach would make sure that we use each one of these. That if we just use all of one route and ignore the other two, we're likely to spend more resources to reduce our climate change risk than if we thoughtfully pushed on each of these margins. So with that, I want to say thank you for the opportunity to be with you here. I'd like to thank the Alpha chapter at the University of Missouri. Have a few papers here for you that are the basis for some of what I put up in the presentation, and look forward to the discussion and the Q&A. Zach.
Okay, great, excellent talk. So we have a few questions here, some common themes. So I'll kind of summarize. Two questions are really about how do you kind of explain this to a lay person, and how do you explain this in a way in a politically charged environment, so that you can kind of explain this right while acknowledging that some people don't even acknowledge that there's a problem.
Right. So the first thing I would say is, you know, if I were folks at the Climate Leadership Council that has pushed this tax and dividend approach, they like to emphasize the dividend. They like to emphasize that we're going to get serious about improving the environment, and the average family of four is going to get $2,000 a year. They acknowledge you may pay a little bit more for energy, but this is something that businesses realize is sort of a smart way going forward. It's not the old liberal way of regulating the economy and the heavy hand of government. And what we're really doing is trying to create the right incentives for innovation. And we've seen this before, that when we sort of leverage the incentives that the market economy delivers for innovation, for scientists, for entrepreneurs, we can really achieve incredible things in our economy. And it's part of why we've realized such incredible economic growth really in the post-World War II era, is because of our ability to take advantage of these incentives in the market economy. So I think the way you make the case that like this is sort of we recognize the problem is serious. I mean, if you're just denying climate change, it's hard to justify any of these policy approaches. But I think like the case is being made, and it's really, if you will, coming out of what I would call the traditional business side of the Republican Party. They think that this is like a serious problem, and this is a thoughtful, serious way to do it. That is the most business-friendly way to do it. That they think is going to drive the necessary innovation, because decarbonizing the economy is not going to be easy. We've cut our emissions in the power sector in the US by about a quarter, and that's been the low-hanging fruit. That's been the kind of low-cost ways of installing renewables. It's taking advantage of cheap natural gas. But part of this is recognizing that as we create these incentives, all we're trying to do is to say to the business community, you figure out the cheapest, smartest way to reduce emissions. All we care about are results. And this approach is focused on that.
Okay, another question that comes up is about geographical diversity, and whether there should be different emissions prices for different countries or perhaps different states within the U.S., taking into account developing versus developed, and then and a follow-up to that is then what impact would that have on coal usage?
Right. So right now across the world, we see a lot of variation in carbon prices. Sweden, for some of their industries, has a carbon price in excess of $100 a ton. India has a tax on coal in their power sector that's now about, I think, $5 or $6 a ton. A lot of variation, even in the United States. Right now, the Northeast CO2 cap and trade program is about, I think, also $6 a ton. California has been about $15, $16 a ton. And so you do see a lot of variation. And in fact, this is one of the things that a lot of the developing countries in international negotiations say: you caused the problem, developed world, you should be doing more. And I think there is a challenge politically, though, in that. It's not that US manufacturing cares what Chad is doing, but we do care a lot about what China is doing. And so the concern is that if we have a really high carbon price in the US, but China has a low carbon price, that could create a disadvantage for the competitiveness of US manufacturing. And in fact, what we've seen, and it goes back into legislative proposals on Capitol Hill for the past 15 years, it's also part of the tax and dividend proposal, is that you put a border tax on the carbon content of the imports coming into the United States, so that once you brought in those imports, those manufactured goods from another country, they've effectively faced the same carbon tax as your domestically manufactured. So it's one way to sort of address those concerns. When we look within the United States, though, there's incredible variation in the carbon intensity of power. And it's quite concentrated because the coal industry itself now only employs about 55,000 workers. It's a really small industry. A lot of the coal still comes out of the Powder River Basin in Wyoming and parts of Montana, but that's quite capital intensive. It's not very labor intensive. Whereas where we've had more labor intensive coal is in Appalachia, a little bit of Southern Illinois, and there a little bit of Western Kentucky as well. And there, I think it's going to be a real challenge. There's not a future for coal when we look at these carbon prices, unless someone can make carbon capture and storage technology commercial and viable. And that's the idea that you'd actually burn coal or burn natural gas, capture it before it goes out a smokestack, and you capture that CO2 and you put it in the ground. And my sense is with other factors driving out coal, especially in the United States, especially cheap natural gas, the future of carbon capture and storage probably is not going to target coal. It's going to target natural gas to see if that can sort of sustain natural gas as a so-called bridge fuel for several decades. And in fact, if you could really make CCS work well and be highly efficient, you could use natural gas in a zero carbon economy if you're able to capture all of that and stick it into the ground.
All right, here's kind of a question on a slightly different subject. Could a carbon tax possibly reduce the overproduction or overuse of plastic? As you drink from your plastic water bottle.
So I think they're trying to tell me it's made from recycled materials. So maybe that's a little bit better. I would say, the challenge there is that there are some who would say plastics that are made from petrochemicals because that's part of the barrel of crude that's not actually being burned, that some of that shouldn't actually count towards a carbon tax. So it wouldn't necessarily raise the price of plastics per se. I think plastics are a really tough problem. And I say they're really tough because in many parts of the world, plastics are actually really important from a public health standpoint. And so there's this challenge about sort of how we deal with all the plastic pollution. But as an economist, I tend to, sort of what's implicit in what I just spent the last half hour or more talking about is that you need to identify what's your problem, in this case, the emissions of CO2, and target exactly that problem. That's being most cost effective is when we put a price on that pollution. And in fact, we can really increase the welfare of our society if we're putting a price on that pollution that's equal to those damages. So that you, as a source of that pollution, you treat it the same as you think about the cost of new materials or the cost of building a new factory, the cost of workers. Those are all things that go into your business calculus, and you want to try to make as much money as possible, recognizing you have those costs. You want the businesses to think about emitting CO2 as a cost, just like those other things, those other factors of production. And so if you're really concerned about the plastics problem, I would say design policy to target plastics. And while there are some benefits beyond climate change from tackling CO2 emissions, most notably reducing local air pollution. I mean, if we're pushing out coal because of climate change policy, that delivers huge public health benefits in terms of reducing asthma, chronic bronchitis, and premature mortality. But in general, I think it's better to say, identify your problem and design a policy instrument to target that problem.
Okay, I think we have time for two more questions. One more question I'm going to summarize. It's from one of my colleagues who likes to be long-winded, and he knows who he is. But basically, the summary is, what about discount rates? So in all of this, of course, there's discount rates, and there's also risk aversion. And so, I mean, one could view climate skepticism not so much as skepticism, but just having different discount rate, right? How does that figure into the calculations of $40?
Right. So the $40 ton number doesn't just sort of come out of thin air. It's reflecting at the time in 2016 the latest assessment of what is the so-called social cost of carbon. So it's taking these integrated assessment models. Bill Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, sharing it with Paul Romer a couple of years ago, was really sort of the father of integrating economics with these climate science and energy and emissions models to be able to say, well, what are the damages from climate change and how should that inform our policy? And so these models estimate that right now emitting a ton of carbon dioxide imposes, in present value terms, about $40 of damages. But of course, present value terms begs the question, what discount rate you're using to calculate this? And the work that was done in the US government under the Obama administration, that $40 ton estimate was based off of a 3% discount rate. Now, it depends on your perspective whether 3% sounds high or low. If you are comparing it to, say, some of the different rates that we face in our everyday lives, like the interest rate on your credit card, 3% seems really low. Typically 3% would seem low relative to mortgages, but anyone who's been in the market this year knows if you're refinancing or buying a new house, mortgage rates might actually be lower than that now because of just how shockingly low long-term bond rates are now in the United States. But the sense is that that rate, from an economic standpoint, should really reflect sort of what we think is going to be the growth in consumption over time. And so, you know, there's been some argument on sort of the ethical dimension. Should we be treating different generations differently? And I think the view has been that even if you want to treat all generations the same, then you would probably say then, though, I would want to treat a wealthier, I'd like to discount, say, the future consumption of a wealthier generation, just because we think there's sort of diminishing marginal utility to consumption if you have a higher level of consumption in a wealthier generation. And so that has typically been the basis for, that has motivated a discount rate. If you use a high discount rate, you use, say, 7%, and that number is used often by the US government to evaluate regulations, then your climate change damages in present value terms are much, much lower. $40 a ton is probably an order of magnitude lower now under a 7% rate, since these models are really trying to take damages that are going out over several centuries to calculate their present value. When the National Academy of Sciences did their evaluation of the hidden cost of energy a decade ago, they said for the social cost of carbon, the estimates in the literature vary by about 2 orders of magnitude. One order of magnitude was variation in damage functions. The other order of magnitude was the choice of discount rate. So it's critically important. I get to spend an entire lecture talking about discount rates. So I just want to acknowledge that it does determine a lot of what's going on here. But I think sort of in the economics literature, there's been more and more of a preference towards lower rates, in part because of uncertainty. That in a world in which you are uncertain about future discount rates, that probably suggests that you would want to be giving more weight to lower discount rate states of the world when conducting your analysis.
All right, and one more question. I think we can end on a positive note with kind of a positive question here. So what is some advice, or what are some career paths that economics or business students can look towards in helping companies become more environmentally friendly?
So I think the great thing is whether you're in a company or you're thinking about the role of investors, they're all thinking about this issue. It's hard to imagine any publicly traded company not getting really serious about climate change. And they're thinking about it in two different ways. They're thinking about what are the risks to, say, our workers and our physical assets because of their exposure to climate change risk, but also what are the risks, but also where are the opportunities when we think about the potential for climate change policy. So I think there's a lot, I gave a few examples of companies that are using internal carbon prices. That's really being driven by the investment community. So there's a lot of people who are in the business of managing, say, retirement funds, pension funds for teachers of a given state or firemen of a given city, or what have you. Like, they're actually saying, we care about climate. We want you to push on those who you invest our assets into to make sure they're doing more on climate. And so I think it's something that used to be like just part of sort of environmental safety and health offices of that really just did sort of regulatory compliance in a lot of these companies. And now it's something that sort of has fed out throughout the entire company. And when I look at some of the recent examples, like BP has taken on some really aggressive changes in where they see their energy investment going in the future. They've set ambitious goals for the company. They've started changing who they actually lobby with, and have actually left a couple of trade associations, but they've actually reorganized the company. And so when you see that, you recognize that this isn't something that just gets done through regulatory compliance, but it's something that is actually part of doing business. It's Microsoft saying, if your unit uses carbon dioxide, you're paying a tax. It's making it clear. In fact, I had a good friend who, when I first talked to him about these issues, was kind of oblivious to it. And then he came back to me about 2 years later and said, I'm now actually working on a carbon reduction plan, even though he's like, I don't think I have anything to do with carbon, but I've now learned how much of our unit is being assigned carbon emissions for the company, and we actually have to pay a tax on that. So we're now figuring out a way to change the way we use energy and source our energy to reduce that tax. Right? So I think it's something that the exciting thing is it plays out in a lot of different parts of companies now. It plays out both on the companies that are making stuff, but also those who are investing in companies. I think it's really happening throughout the business side of things. I would make a plug for my colleague, Rebecca Henderson at the Harvard Business School, who's been teaching a class in recent years called Reimagining Capitalism, and actually has a new book that has come out based off of Reimagining Capitalism. That's really talking about everything that businesses can do, and has a lot of great case studies as well about what companies have done to date that I think really highlight the many different opportunities there are for making a difference in the private sector if you want to combat climate change.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for spending some of your evening with us here at Mizzou. And we look forward to hearing more from you and your work, and reading in the literature and keeping up with your career. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Zach. It's been a pleasure to be here.